Most Americans have no idea that ancient cities with advanced architectures once dotted the ancient North American landscape.
Very, very few of us were conscious of the immensity of a place like Monk's Mound at Cahokia, opposite St. Louis, which is bigger in its footprint than the Great Pyramid at Giza. We didn't know that.
The knowledge embedded in these earthworks and encoded in their structure is anything but primitive. It's remarkable.
What I've learned now is just how amazing they were in terms of their knowledge of the solar system and of mathematics.
Artifacts of iron were found, artifacts of hardened copper, stone tablets with writing. Regular farmers just plowing their fields would really turn up literally bushel baskets of arrowheads, spear points, etc. And these things were commonplace. Some people, such as Caleb Atwater and Squire and Davis, they believe the artifacts that they were finding around these mounds and cities and earthen structures, that this was representative of an advanced civilization.
The science of archaeology was really in its infancy at that time. There were only a few people using what we would consider to be even remotely modern methods.
According to the scholarly journal of the Ohio Historical Society, quote, "No subject received more attention or stirred more controversy among archaeologists in the 19th century than the authenticity and presumed meaning of the engraved stone tablets that were periodically recovered from the mounds."
And there are various things fueling these. There were religious, political, and social agendas.
Doctrine of manifest destiny allowed the United States government to classify the Native Americans as savages by their terminology. And by calling them savages, that would allow them to push them aside and basically claim their lands as America expanded in a westward direction.
Politically, it would have been impossible for them to have taken lands away from Indians, from any indigenous peoples, if they viewed them as having rights even close to what they had as American citizens.
Manifest destiny, the idea that American First Nations had never achieved anything worth preserving, has resulted in the wanton destruction of thousands and thousands of earth constructions, mounds, embankments, figures, and settlements.
Science did tell them that there were certain races that were superior and some that were inferior.
We would say that's bad science, where you want to discount information because it kind of doesn't fit what you think you see. And what you see is what people saw at the time were these savages who were in this pitiful state.
So we have lost incalculable amount of archaeological data because of no appreciation of their value for historical purposes.
I want to show you some things that I don't think you even knew existed. It goes against everything Manifest Destiny teaches about Native Americans. And I want you to know this part of our history because people erased it, and we'll get to that later on in the program. Erased it intentionally. That's an important part of it. America's history didn't begin with Christopher Columbus came over. There were ancient cities with advanced architectures all across North America. Did you know that? Hundreds of years before Columbus came. We always think, oh, the Indians, they didn't scar the land. No, not true. These were cities as large as any in the world at the time. London or Rome, they were metropolises. Archaeologists say they have found evidence of 200,000 actual cities of mound-like structures all across North America that were here long before Columbus. But we don't know anything about them. Why? Why? Especially when you hear what you're about to hear. I want to show you 3 incredible examples of these Indian mounds that were discovered. But before I show you this, I want to ask yourself, I want you to ask these questions. Was Jackson right? Andrew Jackson, Manifest Destiny, the beginning of that. Was he right that the Native Americans were savages? Or was Jefferson right that there was something going on here that we don't even understand? Maybe they were descendants of Egyptians or Jews, or maybe they were from Asia. Where were these people from? But they weren't savages. I want you to take a look at this. This is going to blow your mind. See this here? First, let me show you the Great Pyramid of Giza. You've seen this, one side of the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you measure it, it is from the bottom to the apex 606 feet. That's important. That's an ancient unit of measurement. It's referred to as the stade. Now I want to show you this. These are the Newark earthworks. They're here in Ohio. Yes, Ohio. The earthworks are made, they're structures that are made now of earth that has been built up from the ground in a perfect circle. Here it is, a perfect circle and a perfect octagon. But they were built by the ancient Hopewell civilization. They date back from 300 BC to 400 AD. So let's look at these structures here. Bring this up. I want to show you something. If you square the inside of the octagon, here's a square and here's a square. If you square it, this is what surveyors do when they're measuring. They square the circle, and then they divide that area into 4 equal parts, or cubes, and then you find that each cube is made up of 606 feet, 606 feet, 606 feet, 606 feet. 606. It's made up of stades, exactly the same. Now, if that's not interesting enough, look at the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you take the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the slope is 51.8 degrees. Let's go back to the earthworks. If you measure the line that goes straight through the center of the structure, right here, and then you go true north, it's 51.8 degrees. That angle is exactly the same angle as the pyramids of Giza. It is the same math, the same calculations as ancient Egyptians. Let me show you one more connection. In 1860, David Wyrick, he's a guy who surveyed the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near those earthworks, and he found a wooden coffin made of oak. They opened up the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box. It was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here at first they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that, and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the 10 Commandments. Now, this is another piece. Block Hebrew, they said they'd never seen anything like it. Mainstream archaeologists at the time called this a hoax. But then in 1900, or just about after 1900, in Israel, they found the same block-style Hebrew writing. Mainstream archaeologists still dismissed the findings. They found it in Israel, and they found it in Ohio. But there was another stone that they found that they couldn't argue. This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee, since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew. They had published this originally upside down. They threw it in a box at the bottom of the Smithsonian, put it in the basement. Many years later, a scholar took it out of the box, looked at it, and went, oh my gosh, it's upside down. It's Phoenician, ancient Hebrew. So what's going on here? What is that about? Where is that history? I'll show you in a few minutes, and we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to show you some more things that the Smithsonian, science, government, commerce colluded to erase. By the way, I want to thank the directors of the documentary Lost Civilizations of North America for bringing these stories to my attention. I was blown away. To find more, visit the website lostcivilizationdvd.com. Here's the thing we should be asking ourselves. I don't know the story of these. Do you know that? Did you know that? Do you live in Ohio and did you know that? Why not? Were the American Indians wronged? Yes. Yes. And that's what we focus on in America. Is we were bad to the American Indians. Forget about it. It's in the past. The question should be the ones that the founders asked. Who are they? What knowledge do they have? Can you imagine the difference we would have now if we would put our differences aside and put our past in the past and concentrate on today and say, let's learn from each other. What do you have? What is that? What is that? When we come back, I'm going to be joined by Peter Lilback, who is, I've told you before, is one of my favorite authors. He's going to talk to me a little bit about the founders here. And I'm also going to show you some documents that show how that history has been erased. Next. This is the Smithsonian Annual Report, 1882-1883. This is John Wesley Howell. This is an original copy. John Wesley Howell in 1789. Again, this is Powell. This is the director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute. He said this. Artifacts found prior to Christopher Columbus's arrival would be considered illegitimate by the Smithsonian. Only the savage Indian culture would be observed, and this created the artificial barrier to science. Only the savage. Science was colluding with government because of commerce, and religion was involved. Now, why do I tell you all this stuff? Not because I'm an Indian expert or anything else. You got to do your own homework. I just found out about this stuff. I'm amazed by it. I don't know what the answer is on this. The reason why I bring it up is the stock is not bad. The soup went bad, but the stock is not. Peter Lilback, Dr. Peter Lilback. How are you, sir?
Good to see you.
This is a book that needs to be owned by every American. Every single American should have this book in their home. It's called Sacred Fire. These are the words of George Washington, and it takes history absolutely apart. Not on somebody's opinion, but on their own words, on his words. Peter, I want to go to you and talk to you a little bit about, again, the stock. George Washington had a good relationship. Our founders had a good relationship with the Native Americans, right?
There's no question about that. When they came to America, they realized they could not survive without a close relationship with the Indian people. The greatest story, for example, is the Pilgrims who are blown off course. 800 miles out of their destination in Virginia, they're in Massachusetts. They land on ground, and they're in the middle of nowhere, no government. They make the Mayflower Compact, so they have government when they land. And there's no Native Americans there because a plague had gone through, but one person shows up. He happens to be a Native American that knew English. He'd actually been taken captive to England. He'd learned English. He'd gotten his freedom. He came back, his people were gone. The white settlers are there all of a sudden, and he meets them and he says, welcome. He speaks English. They couldn't believe it. The providence of that moment is extraordinary. They needed help, and there was a person there to help them, and he was a Native American.
Right.
And that creates Massachusetts.
All right. Do I have time for one more story real quick? No? Okay, hang on, because I want to come back and talk about, William Penn. Because William Penn said something when he was working with the Indians that is critical to understand the truth, I think, about America. And we'll do that next. The history that has been erased in our nation, in particular with the Native Americans, happened because it didn't fit the story they created, Manifest Destiny. It only works when Indians were savages, and they had to have savages for commerce and government to expand. The ancient artifacts prove otherwise. Why aren't we looking into those? Peter Lilback is the president of Providence Forum and the author of George Washington's Sacred Fire. Okay, Peter, I think a great place for Americans to understand the truth about Americans and Native Americans and African Americans, all of it. It comes from William Penn. Tell the story.
Great story. Philadelphia, the great founding city of the United States. That's where government began. It was founded by William Penn. He wanted a city without walls. And he determined that he would do it by making a constant commitment to justice and ethics with the Native Americans. There never was an Indian war with William Penn. And there's a wonderful treaty that still exists that describes the commitment they made. And it says this: there are good people and bad people among all people. There are good and bad Indians. There are good and bad Christians. That's what he called them in Philadelphia. And he said, we must come together so that we will address these problems that will come with respect and by communication, affirming the good.
That's where we need to be. There are good among us and bad among us. There are good Americans, bad Americans. There's good parts of America. There are bad parts of America in the American story. We've got to come together as the good people, stand together and guard against the bad so we can live in a country without walls. Peter, thank you very much. Back in a minute. To expand our own understanding of America, good, bad, and ugly, with the Civil Rights Movement tomorrow and Friday. And then we'll see you down at the mall in Washington, D.C. on 8/28. Don't miss it. History in the making. From New York, good night, America.
Perhaps DNA science can settle once and for all the biological question of who, for example, the Hopewell mound builders were.
We can use DNA to help us reconstruct the past and the history of different populations, because your DNA is passed down from your parents from generation to generation. There are certain types of DNA in particular that are very useful for reconstructing population prehistory. Your mitochondrial DNA is DNA that every person has, and you inherit it from your mother. Your mother passes it on to her children. Men don't pass it on to their children. And this type of DNA therefore gives us a measure of matrilineal relatedness. I collected DNA from and analyzed DNA from a couple of different Hopewell cemetery populations. When we looked at DNA from these two different Hopewell populations, from Illinois and Ohio, we found that there were 5 primary mitochondrial DNA lineages present. These lineages have become designated by letter names in the scientific world, and the ones that we see in Native American populations, both living today and in these Hopewell cemeteries, were the mitochondrial lineages A, B, C, D, and X. And these 5 lineages are ones that are common today in Native Americans, and they were the ones that were present in these ancient Hopewell communities. When we look at the distribution of haplogroup X in the Americas, we see that it's present in about 3% of all Native Americans, but it's more common in some populations. In particular, peoples who live in the upper Great Plains exhibit much higher frequencies of haplogroup X, sometimes up to 25 or 30 or even 50% in some samples that have been studied.
DNA science apparently settles the biological questions of who these ancient, advanced Hopewell mound builders were. But where else is this DNA found? And where did it originate?
The form of haplogroup X that's present in the Americas is known as haplogroup X2A, and this specific type is defined by a number of additional mutations that Native Americans who belong to haplogroup X share.
There's a lot about DNA evidence that is a controversy.
Haplogroup X is really a fascinating story because the X-files of Native American genetics, because it burst on the scene in 1998. Scientists didn't want to believe it, but they found a new haplogroup in addition to A, B, C, D among the Indians of the Great Lakes in particular. And that was haplogroup X. And so immediately the scientists who have a kind of idée fixe, in my opinion, set about trying to find haplogroup X in Mongolia and Siberia, because of course all American Indians, all upstanding American Indians came across the Bering Land Bridge chasing woolly mammoths, right? So they weren't able to find haplogroup X in Siberia. Haplogroup X was a Eurasian type. So then they started talking about, oh, well, maybe they got here by jumping across the ice in a circumpolar fashion. Okay. Well, it kind of rested there for a while. Is it true that all Native Americans came from 10 families that stumbled across the Bering Strait chasing woolly mammoths before the last ice age? I don't think mine did.
I'm haplogroup X, and on further investigation, I believe I am haplogroup X2A, which is found in the Ojibwe populations, and Sioux, and Navajo, and a couple of more that I can't even pronounce, even though I'm from this continent in North America. And there are 5 different haplogroups found in North America: A, B, C, D, and X. Yes, haplogroup X. What if haplogroup X did cross over the Atlantic and not through the Bering Strait as otherwise hypothesized? The reason that's hypothesized by some scientists in this world is because there are very few or no traces of an X haplogroup anywhere along the Asian migration route, which would cover from the Fertile Crescent, going through those mountains, I don't know all the countries, through India, through China, through like Vietnam, Asia, all those countries, Japan, over the sea, well actually up through Siberia, and through the Yukon, well I would call it the Yukon today because I'm Canadian, and down through North America. But the X haplogroup has been linked to the Clovis Point arrowheads. Clovis Point arrowheads is a certain type of an arrowhead that was designed and used by hunters about 17,000 years ago in and around the areas known as today, what we know as France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Netherlands, like those areas. And they came here. And they continue to survive, yes, perhaps for 5,000 more years before other peoples, the A, B, C's, D's, came over from the Bering Strait with their male counterparts. And there was lesser male counterparts that survived than females, but you'll find that throughout the world, and there's a darn good reason for it. Anyways, we'll look into that here. And so, yeah, Swan X. Yes, I think we came over the Atlantic.
It also shows that not just high math, but these sites are lined up primarily with the lunar calendar. They had high math, they understood geometry, and because of the lunar calendar, they also understood the heavens, astronomy.
What I've learned now is just how amazing they were in terms of their knowledge of the solar system and of mathematics.
And the lunar calendar comes from the Mediterranean, and then they had the unit of measurement was 606, which they call the stade. One side of the Great Pyramid from the base to the tip of the apex is 606 feet. If you square inside the octagon, which the surveyors like to call, it's a term they use, squaring the circle, and you divide that up into 4 equal parts inside of cubes, you'll find those cubes are all made of 606-foot lines per cube side. The angle of the Great Pyramid of Egypt runs 51.8 degrees, up the slope from the base to the angle. That measurement is there, and when you come off of the baseline at Newark and you run true north and then measure that angle back to the baseline, what do we find? 51.8 degrees. So did they have the same math as the ancient Egyptians? Well, I gotta say, yeah, it sure looks like it.
It's as inspiring, I think, in its way as the NASA program to send a man to the moon.
Most of the Mediterranean societies, civilizations, ran their calendar on the lunar cycle, or a 13-month calendar. And that can be fully demonstrated with the Hopewell people as well. Again, another nice parallel to the Mediterranean contact.
We own the Newark Holy Stones, and these stones were found in a Hopewell mound in the 1860s, and the presumption from finding them was that perhaps the American Indians had some kind of contact with the Hebrews, or possibly they were the Hebrews. That's another idea. So we have the museum has been interested in origins.
They took it to some scholars, identified that it was probably some type of Hebrew. They took it to some rabbis living in the area, and upon looking at it, they said yes, they could read it. And it was a complete rendition of the 10 Commandments. They called it block Hebrew because they had never seen anything written like this, but they called it block Hebrew.